Welcome to Yahoo Finance Sports Report, a unique look at the business of sports, brought to you by Yahoo Finance and Yahoo Sports. I'm your host, Joe Pompliano, and I'm here to coach you through the financial game. We'll look beyond the headlines, analyze all the latest sports news, the teams, trades, and billion-dollar deals, so you and your portfolio will win big. This week, we'll take a look ahead at the World Series, which kicks off Friday night. A look back at the WNBA, who wrapped up their season earlier this week. We'll break down why you should care about the Las Vegas Sphere and so much more. Plus, we've got Jordan Rogers, a sports marketer, joining the show later to discuss all things Nike. Let's huddle up and get right into it. The first topic today in Pomp's playbook is Tom Brady's Raiders purchase and his stake being approved by the other NFL owners. Now, for those who haven't seen it yet, Tom Brady bought a 10% stake in the Las Vegas Raiders with his business partner, Tom Wagner, at a valuation of $3.5 billion, according to CNBC Sport. Now, the reason why this is so unique is because if you look at sports franchises across the NFL, MLB, NBA, NHL, etc., typically a minority purchase of equity in the franchise would sell somewhere for maybe a 20 to 25% discount. The reason why they sell at a discount relative to a premium or regular average price is because most owners really don't get anything unless you own the actual majority stake in the team. And what I mean by that is you don't have any liquidity, so there's no way to get your money out. You don't really get anything outside of season tickets, and you don't get to make any personnel or team decisions. That's left to majority owner. But the interesting thing about Tom Brady's purchase is that he got more than a 50% discount, whereas most people would get a 20 to 25% discount. The reason why he was able to secure that is, one, because he's Tom Brady, but Raiders owner Mark Davis says that not only is he going to potentially help the team draft a franchise quarterback in the upcoming draft, but he might even help train them. So he got a great deal. I think he's going to make a lot of money on this franchise, but also this impacts his ability as a broadcaster. Now, everyone knows that Fox Sports recently signed Tom Brady to a deal that pays him $37.5 million annually to broadcast NFL games. But now that he's a minority owner, this impacts his ability to do that because he's no longer allowed to sit in production meetings with coaches and players. He can't criticize officials or team owners while broadcasting as well. So it's going to make his job a little bit more difficult, but he's Tom Brady. So my guess is he's going to find a way to work around it. Next up is the World Series, which kicks off this Friday night. Now, if you're Major League Baseball or Fox Sports who's going to be broadcasting this World Series, you couldn't be happier with the outcome. And the reason I say that is because we have the Los Angeles Dodgers on one side playing against the New York Yankees. Now, these are two behemoths in Major League Baseball, but they also happen to be, number one, the two biggest media markets in the country, and number two, have the two most recognizable players in Major League Baseball today, not only in the United States, but globally in Aaron Judge and Shohei Ohtani. But they also have Mookie Betts, they also have Juan Soto, and a whole host of other players. If you look at the top 10 jersey sales this year in Major League Baseball, I think there's 4 or 5 Dodgers and Yankees players in there. So it's a star-studded affair, and we're looking at two of the most expensive teams that baseball has ever seen. Fox and Major League Baseball are going to make a ton of money off this, not only in the United States, but also internationally because of Shohei Ohtani and his teammate, Yamamoto. Now, if you look at Game 5 of the NLDS, which happened a couple weeks ago, there were 12.9 million viewers in Japan. That's important for two reasons. Number one, it's more viewers than we had for that game in America. Literally in Japan, more people watch that game than in America. And number two, that means that 10%, roughly 10% of Japan's entire population watched that game at 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning. The World Series is going to be even bigger, and I think there's a chance that we reach 20, 22, 23 million viewers average if this game goes the distance and it's a competitive series. But the last thing I want to talk about in Pomp's playbook today is F1 in Austin. Now, I was in Austin, Texas this past weekend for the Formula One race at COTA, and it was fantastic. But it had me thinking a little bit of just how far Formula One has come in the United States. And I think it's really something. If you look at Liberty Media, the company that bought the series in 2017, they have totally transformed this series. And I think they mostly get credit for partnering with Netflix on Drive to Survive and introducing the racing series to a bunch of new people, specifically here in America. But the thing that I think is even more interesting is what they did on the media rights side of things. If you look a few years ago, they literally gave the media rights away to ESPN for free. So everyone knows, right? Media rights are the most expensive thing in the way that most of these sports leagues primarily make their money. But Formula One came in and gave the rights to ESPN for free in the US initially because they knew that ESPN had the largest distribution channel when it came to sports rights, and they wanted more people to watch these races. And if you fast forward today, not only is that media rights fee now at $75 million annually, which is a great step up, But Austin specifically, this is a race that used to have 260,000 people attending before the Drive to Survive series. And last year, they had over 430,000 fans, which made it one of the biggest Formula One races on the entire calendar. Next up, we've got the deeper dive, where I give you a play-by-play analysis of news in the sports world and its significance to your bottom line. This week, we're going to be talking about the WNBA. The WNBA finals just wrapped up this past week with the New York Liberty winning their first ever WNBA championship against the Minnesota Lynx in 5 games. Now, the WNBA finals only plays 5 games, not 7. So it went the distance and it was an amazing series. If you look at viewership for this series, it literally climbed the entire way, game after game after game. We started with 1.1 million viewers for game 1 and ended with game 5 having over 2.15 million average viewers. That's incredible, and it means we saw more than 2 times as many viewers for this year's WNBA finals as we did for last year's WNBA finals. But we all know that the WNBA has had a great year. The reason why I want to talk about this is because there's a way to differentiate it between what they did last year and what they're going to be doing in the future. If you look at last year, the WNBA set records for literally everything. We're talking about viewership, attendance, merchandise sales, sponsorships, everything. And a lot of this, of course, was due to Caitlin Clark. Her games averaged more than 1 million viewers, where all the other games that didn't include her averaged about 400,000 viewers. But the WNBA is still growing, and now the players want a bigger slice of the financial pie. The WNBA Players Association announced earlier this week that they're going to be opting out of their collective bargaining agreement. Now, the CBA is essentially what regulates pay and all the other circumstances around the league itself and the Players Association. It's a union negotiated contract. So by opting out, they have to go negotiate a new one after next year before the following season. And essentially what the players are saying is that they're seeing everything go up and to the right, and they want their salaries to increase, whereas someone like Caitlin Clark is only making about $75,000 a year, and the MVP this year, Asia Wilson, only got paid about $200,000. They think those salaries should be much higher. But I would caution people with this. And I actually think there's a solid chance that we may end up seeing a lockout in the WNBA, primarily because the economics of the league are extremely difficult given their past. For those that don't know, the WNBA has lost about $10 million a year for several decades now. That has primarily been covered by the NBA, who owns 60% of the business today. The WNBA then went out and raised an additional investment round a couple of years ago, selling off another 15% of the cap table, and that leaves them with just 25% of the cap structure today. The reason why this is important is because losses actually accelerated to over $40 million this year, primarily because they added in a private jet charter program that cost around $25 million a year on top of the $10 million that they were losing before. Now, there is some light at the end of the tunnel because the WNBA recently signed a new media rights deal that's worth $2.2 billion over 11 years. They're going to sell one more package on top of that. So they're going to go from making around $50 million in media rights to over 200, maybe $250 million in media rights. That's obviously great. But when you have to divvy that money up with the NBA, the new investment group, and less than 40% of that money actually flows down to the league and the players itself, it makes it much more difficult to give the players this huge raise that they're all expecting. Now we've made it to the point of the one-on-one, a conversation where I get to break down news and sports with a key player in the industry. This week, I was joined by Jordan Rogers, a sports marketer who spent 15 years working for Nike. Let's get into that conversation. Jordan, how are you? Thanks for joining.
Hey, always good to be with you, Joe.
Awesome. Let's talk about Nike. Nike's been in the news a lot over the last few weeks. They obviously fired their CEO. They brought in a new CEO who I think you know on a personal level to some degree, but has been at the company for several decades at this point. Just give me a kind of sense of how you're feeling about this transition.
Yeah, I think this is a long time coming at this point. The first couple of years of John Donahoe's tenure at Nike, you could give him a pass. I think January 2020, I believe, is when he took over the job. March of 2020, some serious global issues happened, affecting all companies and affecting the globe. But as time kept going on, you started to see some of Nike's competitors like On and Hoka and others capitalizing upon this market. And while Nike went up during the early days of the pandemic, like a lot of companies, they started to go down and down and down and continue to suffer, whether that was culturally from insiders or whether externally people's perception was there as well. And so I think as every 6 months to a year, and each reorg that didn't work from the time before, and we were reorging again and laying off people again and restructuring the company again, you started to get the sense that they were just making more of a mess than when they originally started. And so I think this new hire of Elliott Hill going back to an original Nike guy will, at least pay some dividends here in the early days versus an outsider like John Don, who had been a previous management consultant. So time will tell. Generally, insiders at Nike have done better at the helm of the CEO.
So why do you think that is, right? Because for those that don't know, Elliott Hill started literally as an intern at Nike. He worked his way up through several divisions and now is going to be the president and the CEO of this massive company. But you alluded to it a little bit there of how these insiders typically do a little bit better of a job than people that are brought in from the outside. Like, what is Elliott Hill going to have an advantage on that John Donahoe necessarily didn't?
A guy like Elliott Hill represents the best of what Nike was and what attracted people to Nike. I think over the course of whether it was the 90s or the 2000s, when Nike started to become a really sexy company and it started to attract people who I refer to them as kind of the LinkedIn previously people who are just stacking, cool companies of places that they've gone for tenure for a couple of years. So you would look at like the previously Apple, previously Google, previously Facebook, previously Nike. When you started to attract those people who are kind of transient and coming in and out and putting it as a check on the resume, I think you started to lose some of that. And the best companies will have a good way to merge both. But I don't know that Nike has really figured that out well, at least as it comes to the highest levels.
And if I was to ask an equity analyst on Wall Street and I was like, what is wrong with Nike? Why is the stock going down? My assumption would be that most of them would say it's trading at, I don't know, 25 to 30 times revenue and there's no growth year over year. It's actually declining year over year from a revenue perspective, which is obviously not good. But it feels like to me, the actual problems can be summarized much more concisely, which is like, their core competency over the last several decades has always been the running community and being cool and innovative in that sector. And as the pandemic happened, they pulled all of their inventory from the stores, leaving that shelf space open to brands like On Running or Hoka or these like newer, cooler, innovative brands. Whereas Nike has shifted its focus a little bit more, trying to maximize profit by doing everything online. Do you think that's kind of like a fair assessment of macro kind of what went wrong?
Running is the foundation of the brand at Nike. And whether you think about Nike through a running lens or not, that is where the company was founded. And that is where they have always declared that they want to win on a battleground standpoint. And one of the key missteps in the direct to consumer strategy, Nike had a lot of mom and pop retailers that they had been partnered with over decades. And in this strategy of the direct-to-consumer offense, where they wanted to bring much more of Nike's business internally to Nike.com and into Nike stores, they kind of miscalculated how much of the people were connected through their local retailers and through their local malls and through their local sporting goods stores. The places that Nike stores exist are really only in your big fancy cities, your New York, LA, Chicago, and they have them in other big cities, but that does not account for a lot of other people in the country. And lastly, to your point there, you used to have in these running specialty accounts, right, which are very influential with top runners, elite runners, people who are getting there. They're the type of places who will fit you for running footwear. And Nike used to purchase and have a big relationship with them and have a large shelf space there. And so when they started to pull back from that, these retailers like them, Foot Locker has been on record saying this, were looking to occupy that shelf space with something else. And On and Hoka were these challenger brands who came in and said, hey, we'll take that shelf space and we've got all kinds of footwear that can help fill that space. And so it was welcome to the retailers. And then consumers started to say, oh, wow, we have more choice here. There's other types of footwear that are available. And they started to steal some of that market share from Nike.
We've got to take a quick break, but we'll be back with more of my conversation with Jordan Rogers right after this. Welcome back to Yahoo Finance Sports Report. I'm your host, Joe Pompliano. Here's more of my conversation with sports marketer Jordan Rogers. If you were in charge of Nike, how do you right the ship?
You have to start with the culture and, treating people in a really kind way, being a good leader, being a people first leader. And Elliott is certainly a step in the right direction there. So I think this is going to be a lot about having the troops buy in, and then they can all start marching in the same direction.
From a trends perspective, is there anything that you would be excited about at Nike?
I think that the rise of the WNBA and Caitlin Clark effect and all of the other athletes there, the rise of women's sports, Nike has had a checkered past with that stuff, but I do think that Elliott talked about this in one of his interviews. They said Nike, the mentality at Nike is to be treated like an athlete. And so you look at what are we doing right? Where do we fall short? And how can we get better going forward? And I will say there is a huge concerted effort internally at Nike to try to lead with women and invest in women's sports and to grow. And a lot of people don't give them enough credit, but they partnered and invested in the WNBA years ago and have all kinds of programs there. So I would say that they were there laying the groundwork and helping build the kindling that Caitlin Clark came in and set on fire. And all of the many women who have been in that league for years prior, doing great work, playing at a high level. And so this stuff doesn't happen overnight. I think they were there. They should be credited for that and that investment. And now it's about capitalizing. They have the most lightning rod athlete in the game, like Caitlin Clark. They've got others who were lighting up the Olympics, like Sha'Carri Richardson and many others. And so I think there's a lot of things that they can hang their hat on. But it will be about now, LeBron James is retiring. Kevin Durant is kind of moving to his sunset. Can this next generation of athletes be as influential as those? There's a guy by the name of Nate Jones was talking about this recently. LeBron and Steph are these last athletes of monoculture, and Nike really dominated in monoculture, meaning when there was 3 magazines and 5 television channels who told you what was important. Nike really dominated in that in an era of consolidation. And now that we have so much fracturing and consumers have so many choice and everybody has a different algorithm, I think that will be the challenge for Nike in this new era if they can evolve and capitalize upon that in their own way. They certainly have the war chest, they have the athletes, they have the influence, and now it'll just be about executing and rallying the troops to deliver on that.
What are these athletes looking for when they sign? Is it just straight up, we want the most money imaginable? Or are there other things that draw people to Nike outside of that?
I'd actually argue a lot of times it's the counter. Many of the challenger brands are going to offer them more cash sometimes. But you think like in a sport like basketball, most of these athletes have grown up wearing Nike their whole life. I look at an athlete like Cooper Flagg, who just made his debut for Duke, and he is signed to New Balance for an off-court apparel and footwear deal, but he's required to wear Nike on court for Duke because they have the larger deal with the university. I could not find a single image of Cooper Flagg wearing New Balance prior to him getting his deal, or at least being in talks with that company in the last few months. And so you just have such a distinct advantage of an athlete like that who has worn it their whole life. Caitlin Clark would be another example of this. And when you come to the table bidding against other teams, oftentimes, yes, Nike for an athlete like Caitlin does have the money to be able to put up, but they also have a demonstrated example of this pantheon of athletes that they've also grown up worshiping. So you have athletes like Serena Williams, LeBron James, Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, any of the ones that you might want to throw out there. And these athletes have grown up worshiping them, and they've also seen the incredible campaigns. And so some of these athletes who want to have that longer lasting legacy, I would still argue that there's no brand who can give you a longer lasting legacy and build your aura more than Nike when they want to invest in you. Now, the downside of that is and that's an athlete who can bet on themselves. Sometimes if you're kind of mid-level or a lower level, you might get lost in the sauce at Nike. So I look at an athlete like Tyrese Halliburton, who just got announced at Puma this morning. Tyrese Halliburton would be, I don't know, 15th on the bench at Nike in the men's basketball division. But at Puma, he's probably top 5, top 3. And so there's always different factors. And, now it's about all of these young challenger brands, like a Puma Hoops, like Moolah Kicks is a young footwear brand that was started by a young woman that's made only for women. There are athletes like Jonathan Isaacs at in the Orlando Magic, who has made his own signature footwear. He is a conservative Christian and has made footwear that represents his views. And he's done this with a factory just over the last couple of years from himself. And so I think this world is changing where athletes have more choice and they're going to be offered more equity. We've seen this with later athletes like Roger Federer and Tiger Woods. And I think that's going to start happening with younger athletes earlier, where companies will come in and say, hey, we're going to share equity with you. We're not just going to make you an endorser like a traditional company like a Nike, Adidas, or Under Armour would. So time will tell. But right now, Nike still has a big advantage.
All right, Jordan, last question for you. I need a prediction. A lot of people have been looking at things that Nike has been doing over the last 6 months, but I want to know what you expect them to do over the next 6 to 12 months.
It seems like the only way they can go up is up from here. They're half of what they were at their peak, I believe. I just looked at it last week. I think they're at $85, $87. Right before I left in 2021, I think they were at 166. So I think they can only go up from here. You probably were able to get a bargain on the stock in the last few months while it was down in the depths. So I would expect them to, rise, but we'll see. There's so much that is changing. I'm going to be really interested to see if they're able to evolve to this new landscape that I've just never seen. Often people would ask me, like, who would overtake Nike as a challenger? And I believe if Nike were to suffer or fall away, it's going to be death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's not going to be some other big player who takes them down. There's just so much option today. There's so much choice. Manufacturing has been democratized in such a fascinating way. And so I think that will be the real challenge, to see whether they can weather that storm. But history shows that Nike does bounce back, and they usually bounce back stronger. So if I were a betting man, I would say that they would bounce back.
I agree with that. If you look at every period of sustained growth for Nike, it usually follows a period of something like this, where they had to go through something and they came back and they innovated and they did something well. So we'll see. You, I, and I'm sure millions of others will be watching as well. But thanks so much for joining us, Jordan.
Absolutely. Keep up the good work, Joe.
All right, everyone, the clock is winding down here, but we have just enough time for some final buzz. I want to end today's episode by talking about the Sphere going international. Now, I'm sure all of you have seen and heard about the Las Vegas Sphere at this point. It's a multi-billion-dollar project by James Dolan and his company, Madison Square Garden. They've hosted a number of concerts over the last few months, and they even hosted a UFC event in September. That was the first ever sporting event in the Sphere, and it was a record-breaking event. It cost more than $20 million to produce, but it also had a live gate of $22 million, a record for the UFC. And that's not counting pay-per-view or anything else. But now the Sphere is officially getting its second location. After purchasing a property in London for over $75 million last year, that project fell through. The Sphere is now announcing that that land is going to be going up for sale, and their second project is shifting from London to Abu Dhabi. This seems to be part of a larger partnership between the Madison Square Garden Company and Abu Dhabi, because they're also adding a jersey patch deal on top of the next jersey, which is estimated to cost somewhere between $20 to $30 million a year. So this hasn't been built yet, but Abu Dhabi is going to be fronting the cost, and it's ultimately going to become one of the biggest tourist destinations in the country. Something to look out for as we continue to see this project grow, given that their stock is up more than 30% this year so far and over 34% over the last 12 months. We're all out of time, so it's officially game over this week. Thank you so much to Jordan Rogers, and for all of you for joining us. I'm your host, Joe Pompliano. See you next time.
This content was not intended to be financial advice and should not be used as a substitute for professional financial services.